Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have a brand new Urban Decay Moondust palette. This is their Ice Out palette. Now I believe I saw the leaks for this one all the way back in the spring. I do think it was available in China a few months ago, but I just saw it pop up here in Canada at Shoppers Drug Mart this week. I assume this is going to be one of their holiday launches. It's not yet at Sephora Canada, and I don't know when it's coming to the US or other retailers, but for right now, it is currently at Shoppers Drug Mart in Canada. I purchased mine for 65 Canadian dollars. Actually less because I used points, but this does retail for 65 Canadian dollars, and this is made in Canada with Canadian and imported ingredients. This also has a 24-month shelf life. Now this is what the inner packaging looks like. So it is just this light blue. It is a plastic compact, and it does sort of have this sort of holographic writing on the front, which I think is really pretty. And then opening this up, you get these four beautiful Moondust shadows. Now, if you're not familiar with the Moondust shadows, these are just some very sparkly, ethereal, wet looking shadows. These aren't meant to have much of a base to them. They are really meant to be sort of that eyeshadow topper or that one and done type of shade. Now they did come out with one of these palettes a couple of years ago, which I also reviewed, and that was this palette right here. So in comparison to the packaging, I do kind of like their last palette just because, I mean, it's pink glitter, but this one had much more neutral everyday shades in here. We had Space Cowboy was one of them, Wild Dipper Rides Again, Star Cowgirl. We had some just very, very neutral shades. So something like this is definitely a bit of a standout. But let's take a quick look at some swatches, and then I think we can do some eye swatches. I'll create a look. I imagine I'll only be able to use one of these shades in a look, but I still think that'll be fine, and then I can share some comparisons and my overall thoughts. But let's hop into these swatches. Now going left to right, we have Ice Slick, and this one is pretty because it looks very white in the pan, but it actually ends up having sort of this pinky blue sort of shift. The next shade is Chilled Out, and on my skin it ends up looking very silver. Bling Bling is probably the most blue shade in the palette, and this really is kind of like a true navy blue. It has a bit of a purplish undertone to it. And Moon Spoon is actually this really beautiful cool tone shade. It's kind of more like a gunmetal. But let me zoom you in and we can get into some eye swatches. All right, so starting with the shade Ice Slick, these shades really are best applied with a finger. That is kind of how I prefer to apply my shimmers anyway, but I do find with the Moondust shadows, a finger is optimal. If you try to go in with a brush or a wet brush, I do still find you have a lot more fallout than you otherwise might. So taking Ice Slick, which I think is going to be my favorite shade, and I'm just going to start putting this one all over the lid. I do just have my eyes primed with my Sigma eyeshadow base in the shade Persuade. That is my favorite primer at the moment. I don't have any powder on top because I really wanted to get the most impact out of these shimmers. So that is the shade Ice Slick, and these are really pretty because they can be really, really beautiful one and done shades, or you can incorporate them with other palettes and other looks. Right, next, going in with Chilled Out. This one just seems a lot more silvery to me. They all have blue elements to them, of course, but this one is more silver leaning, I would say. This one also seems to have a bit more of a base to it than some of the others. That's actually really, really pretty though. So that is the shade Chilled Out. Now what I like about both of these shades a lot is that I actually do not like blue eyeshadow on myself, and I was a little intimidated when I picked this one up, but once I got it in and I saw it in person and I swatched it, and now as I'm putting it on the eyes, this is probably the most approachable blue palette I think I've ever seen, just because it does have these other elements to it. It's really more icy than it is just true blue. So let me take these off, I'll reprime my lids, and we can get into those last two shades. Okay, so getting into these next two shades, I'm going to go in with Bling Bling. This is the most blue shade. I would say of all of them, this is the one I can kind of see myself reaching for the least. It is pretty though. I do feel like this shade has more of a base to it than the other two. It's definitely very blue. This is definitely one that can stand on its own. There's no doubt about that. That actually is very pretty. I am still getting a little bit of fallout, but even just blending those edges. I mean, this shade I would of course need to clean up under my eye, but this shade kind of stands on its own because it's pigmented enough where I was able to blend it into the crease, have a bit more of a structure, but it left that high intense sparkle on the lids. So I think this is pretty, and I do think it kind of stands on its own for sure. But let's go into that final shade, which is Moonspoon. This one also looks really pretty, and I think it's going to offer a similar sort of effect in that it's got, oh yeah, that is beautiful. It has a lot of a base to it, but I think it's one that's definitely going to be able to stand on its own. That's beautiful, actually. I imagine you could go in and just lightly tap it on and get that lighter payoff, but I do also think it looks really, really pretty with this opaque amount of shimmer. And even just blending these edges, that kind of gives me a full one and done look as well. So there we have Moonspoon and Bling Bling. These are really, really pretty. I do think they're beautiful. You do not have to build these. If you don't want to, you could easily just tap into them and then lightly tap it on the lids to get that wet effect without that pigment. But I was kind of trying to see if I could get that sort of high pigment from these. Can they stand on their own? And they definitely can. I really, really like Moonspoon actually. I think that's beautiful. But let me take these off. I will figure out what I want to wear for the rest of the day, and I'll be back to get into my final thoughts and comparisons. All right, so we have the finished final look, and I like how it came together. Definitely very sparkly. I did try to only use this palette and just use two shades. So I actually wanted to keep Moonspoon all over the lid, so that's what I did. I evened them up on both sides, and then I went in with Chilled Out for that inner corner just to brighten things up a little bit, give a little bit of dimension. It doesn't give me a ton, but it gave me something. I do feel like Moonspoon did a really, really nice job staining on its own, letting me sort of blend some of the pigment into the crease without getting glitter everywhere, and sort of leaving that super wet, sparkly look on the lids. So I thought that was really pretty. And then, of course, Chilled Out was just meant to add a little brightness into the inner corner, and I thought it looked quite pretty. You never have to do that, of course. You can just tap these on top of another look just to add a little bit of shine, but I really like that I was able to get a bit of pigment out of these as well. I think that looks really pretty. My favorite shade in the palette is probably Ice Slick. I just love how light and bright it is. I love how shifty it was as well. And so far, my favorite part of this palette is that even though it's very icy and it looks to be very blue, it's not actually as blue as one would think. I think if you are intimidated by blues, you might be comfortable with this one. Now, I don't have a lot of comparisons. Like I said, I'm not a blue eyeshadow girl, but I did want to discuss a couple of comparisons like I always do. So if you have the original Moondust Space Rider palette from a couple of years ago, you can see these are in the same format, but of course the original Space Rider palette has much more of those neutral shades and is really themed around Space Cowboy, whereas this new palette is much more icy. I did pull out the Star palette they came out with last year. I know they did come out with a Moondust Quad, but I already had a lot of shades in that other palette, so I didn't grab that one. I did grab this one, and this has Space Cowboy Rides Again in the center, and this is kind of like a cooler, almost more sparkly version of the original Space Cowboy, and it's beautiful. The rest of these shades are mattes, sequins, and regular metallic, so there really wasn't any sort of overlap here either. And then getting into my collection, I was really grasping because I don't own much blue, but I did pull out the Natasha Denona Xenon palette. Now looking at this, I mean, this is a very gray, very smoky color story in comparison, but I did notice that some of the shades in this Natasha palette do have some more of those navy kind of undertones. They also have some of those shifts as well. They have those silvers. So I'll pop up the swatches and you can of course see that I wasn't able to get 100% shade for shade matches, but I was able to get a similar vibe. The shade Ice Slick I was not able to replicate at all, but I did try. The deeper shades in the palette I did get. Of course, the Urban Decay does pull a little bit more blue, but if you like the tones in Xenon and you want to make it a little bit more blue, a little bit more icy, this could be a nice one. I know the Xenon palette really is a very specific taste and it's not going to be for everyone. I honestly don't know that this one's for me. This is probably one of my least favorite Natasha palettes, but I do think it's very well done for what it is. So if you have this one, you could create some similar looks. You could definitely recreate what I did today, but you're not going to get as many of the blue elements. So just keep that in mind. I did also look at the mini CHRISTYH because this is the bluest palette that I have and I really wasn't able to do much with this either. I was able to have this sort of silver shade Arrow match up with Chilled Out, and I would say that's honestly the closest that I got. I'll pop up those swatches because even the shade Strike in the mini CHRISTYH, which is of course a very shifty duochromatic shade, it really didn't work with the Urban Decay. So there's only the one shade to copy there. And finally, the only other palette in my collection that actually got me kind of close to these shades is from ColourPop. And this is their Twilight palette. And this one has a lot of blues, grays, greens. It's a very gloomy palette. It's really, really nice. And you can kind of see where I was going in terms of those blues. I think the Twilight palette actually gives us the most similar types of shades because we can get into these more navy blues here, but we also have these more silvery shifts. And then popping up the swatches, once again, I was able to get pretty close to the 3 deeper shades in the Moondust. I wasn't able to replicate Ice Slick, but I did get pretty close to the other 3. So if you have the Twilight palette, maybe you can create some similar looks, but just keep in mind in the Twilight palette, you're getting some pressed glitters, you're getting some metallics. These are all going to have much more of a base to them than the Urban Decay, whereas the Urban Decay is meant to give you that more wet, ethereal kind of look. The shimmers in here are very, very sparkly, but they're much more finely milled. So they're meant to give you that sort of scattered light effect, whereas these are meant to be a little bit more opaque. Now, I did kind of get a bit of an opaque look today, but had I gone with the lighter shades in the palette, I likely wouldn't have. Keep in mind, I'm very, very fair, so I think that's why these end up showing up a little bit more opaque. But if you have the Twilight palette, you'll be able to create some similar sort of looks with the shimmers, but in terms of formula, there's no similarity. I do think the Moondust shades are very unique, especially in my collection. I really don't have a lot of single shadows that really compete with this, to be honest. This is a very unique formula. When I go into my singles, they're all very opaque shades. They are either very, very sparkly, very foiled, or they are just very simple, elegant, opaque, sort of metallics. I just don't have a lot of singles in general, and I really don't have a lot of blue. So this is a palette that actually does add a little something to my collection, and that's really, really hard to do in this day and age. So I actually really appreciate that. I like the uniqueness of the formula and even the shades. I wasn't able to find a lot, but if you're someone who has a lot of blue and silver and cool tones, you might be able to find something a little bit more similar in your collection. I don't know that this is a palette I'm going to reach for all the time, but I can see myself using this a lot going into winter, getting closer to holiday. And I mean, the shade Ice Slick, I can see myself reaching for a lot because I think it's pretty. And even Moonspoon, actually, because it really has more of a silver element to it than anything. So I do think that's very pretty as well. I think if you love the idea of blue shadows and sparkly cool tones, but you're kind of intimidated by blue, this could be a really great option. It is a bit pricey at 65 Canadian dollars. US, that's probably going to be around $48. That's usually the conversion. But if you were to buy 4 Moondust singles, they retail for 33 Canadian. So 2 single Moondust shadows would cost more than this whole palette. A single Moondust shade does have 1.7 grams of product. This whole palette has 4. So these are smaller, but you still do get a better value, in my honest opinion. So I do think when you can snag these palettes, these limited edition quads of really beautiful Moondust shades, I do think these are worth it over grabbing their singles, 100%. So overall, I really like this. I'm really happy with it. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I am so sorry I don't know when this is coming to the US or other retailers. So far, I know it's available in China and it just showed up in Canada, so hopefully it'll be available more widely soon. But let me know all of your thoughts down below. Do you have any questions? Are you thinking of picking this one up? Just let me know. I love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.